Hello, welcome to the Signpost 6 interview. Today we will discuss insider threat indicator research on individual and organizational contributing factors with Dr. Frank Greitzer, who is owner and principal scientist of PsyberAnalytix, which performs consulting in applied cognitive and behavioral systems engineering and analysis with a focus on cybersecurity and counterintelligence. Welcome, Frank. Thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for inviting me.
Fantastic. I'd like to start immediately with the first question. In your article, Insider Threats, It's the Human Stupid, you say insider threat programs most often miss the human side of the problem. Can you explain to me what you mean with that?
Okay. Insider threats, it's the human stupid. Insider threat detection methods historically came from cybersecurity tools designed to combat external threats. These tools examine artifacts or traces left behind by malware, viruses, attacks on the network, and so forth. But insiders are trusted individuals who already have access to the network. They have access to the organization's assets. They're real people with real motives and stressors. Typically, they don't start out as insider threats. Research has shown that many of them exhibit concerning behaviors in the weeks or months prior to the actual attack. And there are many indicators that signal potential risks. So by seeking to identify those warning signs, we may be able to address underlying problems more proactively and thereby avoid or reduce the damage. And that's sometimes called getting left of boom.
Thanks for explaining that. And can you provide us some insights into your research into insider threat indicators and the development of your so-called SOFIT ontology?
Yes. So I became interested in insider threats a couple of decades ago when I participated in workshops within the intelligence and information security communities. These workshops focused on approaches to monitoring the stream of technical data, network and host-based cyber data, but generally lacked any consideration of human factors. And it was apparent both behavioral and technical indicators are needed to more fully understand the insider threat. A famous study conducted in the 1990s called Project Slammer provided interviews by psychologists of convicted spies and insider criminals from their jail cells that revealed human aspects of the problem. That research and other case studies that were published in government reports suggests that paying attention to psychological factors and motivations, precipitating events or stressors, and various concerning behaviors can help to better understand and mitigate the risks. I focused my research on behavioral and psychosocial indicators and the need to integrate these types of data with technical data. I built upon that research by developing a formal knowledge base, also called an ontology, of insider threat indicators. This research was funded by the Intelligence Advanced Research Projects Activity, or IARPA, which is part of the U.S. intelligence community. And the SOFIT ontology came out of that. SOFIT stands for socio-technical and organizational factors for insider threat. And as such, I would say it is perhaps the most comprehensive knowledge base of potential risk indicators and organizational factors for insider threats.
Yes, and you distinguish between the individual factors and organizational factors, if I may say so. If we just start with the individual factors, how were you able to identify the individual factors?
Well, actually, all of them but in particular, the individual factors were identified based on a bunch of literature reviews, mostly between 2005 and 2010. In that phase of the work, when I was working actually for the National Laboratory with the Department of Energy, we conducted extensive literature searches. That generated a first round of material that consisted of both scientific papers and case studies. And then later, when I was working on that IARPA project, we updated that literature, that body of work in the 2018-2019 timeframes. So that there's hundreds of articles and case studies that went into that, which informed the knowledge base, particularly the knowledge base of insider threat indicators. And in addition to that, over the years, I performed several expert knowledge elicitation surveys in which we tried to tap the knowledge of experts in the security area as well as human resources and cybersecurity to gain more insight into the nature of these indicators. Now, that produced the soffit ontology. And the soffit ontology has two main branches, one of which is individual factors, which are shown here. An individual factor branch is broken into 5 categories. 5 major categories are also called classes: boundary violations, cybersecurity violations, job performance, life narrative, and psychological or psychosocial factors. And each of those main classes further is broken into subclasses. And as you can see, a great many subclasses belong to cybersecurity violations and boundary violations. And these subclasses are then populated with examples of indicators, which are measurable, observable events. So that the entire knowledge base has many hundreds of factors in it, and is in many cases 5 to 6 levels or layers deep.
Mm-hmm. And not all of those factors are as evenly strong predictors of insider threats. In your experience or from research, basically, which ones stand out most, and was this surprising to you?
So yeah, good question. Actually, in the expert knowledge elicitation surveys, in the expert knowledge acquisition exercises that I performed over the years, one of the focuses was to see if we could identify what was important, what things stood out to the experts. And these studies demonstrated, I think, pretty unequivocally that insider threat indicators are not all equal in their severity or in their association with insider threat risk. This was not really a surprise. One would expect that there are certain activities or certain actions that might be performed that are so egregious that they require immediate responses. And as you can see from this diagram, there's a preponderance of relatively higher severity factors in the cybersecurity violation class. But actually, if you look across all of them, there are elements of highly severe, highly concerning indicators in all of these classes. The behavioral or psychological factors are useful if not only, or they're useful for a number of reasons, but also to provide context to help identify individuals who are at risk. And this relates to Eric Shaw's critical pathway model. And perhaps some of these human factors can help to identify personal or professional stressors, which may be addressed proactively to help these individuals exit the critical pathway before committing malicious acts.
Yeah, I can see in this overview that some are more indicators or early indicators, some are maybe a little bit later indicators or clearer indicators of already maybe ongoing violations, like the cybersecurity violation factor classes, as you have there.
Yes.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah. Individual soft indicators, if we want to say it like that, but it's often referred to as soft indicators, might be a more sensitive matter. So these more or soft indicators or earlier indicators. Is that what you experience as well?
Yes, absolutely. So if you compare the so-called the soft indicators or behavioral factors with the technical indicators, it's true. Monitoring of technical indicators is relatively common and not particularly controversial, but collection of behavioral indicators can become a sensitive matter due to the ethical and privacy considerations. Security concerns, in other words, the protection of an organization's intellectual property, physical property, and human assets, must be balanced against the privacy rights of individuals. This depends on the organization's mission and its culture. But I believe that a program based on mutual trust can promote security safeguards while also providing a supportive and productive work environment.
Yeah, maybe to add to your comment on that as well, if you're early in the process, at least you're able to help a person. If you're later in the process, you're more in the detection and repression side of things. So indeed, there is a balance between privacy and security. At the same time, there's also a balance between prevention and more the detection and the repressive side of things.
Absolutely. Amen. That is very true. And it's very much along the lines that I've been writing and talking about.
Mm-hmm. Great. Well, going to the next question. Most organizations are not too keen to focus on organizational factors. It's already difficult for organizations to look inward at their own employees, so to say. And they prefer to focus on the individual as the bad apple. And you are the first to integrate organizational factors into risk profiles. So that means that they don't even only look at their own employees, but actually themselves as the wider organization. Maybe similar to the question on the individual factors, how did you arrive at the organizational factors?
So I love that question as well, because it involves a certain amount of introspection on my part.
Mm-hmm.
So actually, it's an interesting story in a way. While I was working on the insider threat knowledge base, back in actually I was working with CERT at the time. I was consulting with Carnegie Mellon on their unintentional insider threats in the 2013-2014 timeframe. And that caused me to think a lot about especially unintentional insider threats as well as other kinds. And I saw a connection to research that I had done now about 20 years ago, towards in the early 2000s, when I was working with the U.S. Department of Energy on a project that was focusing on causal factors for security incidents. And that work was largely informed by foundational human factors research on human error that dates back to the 1950s, to the mid-20th century, or before that even. And that fundamental work emphasized the important role of systemic factors that contribute to errors and judgment lapses. And you may recall the issues about pilot error or operator error, and the fact that, or the concept of system-induced or design-induced human error. The point is that human error is not random. It's actually derives from, in many cases, underlying systemic factors that contribute to errors and judgment lapses. And back in the mid-20th century, there was a lot of attention to system design. And so you had a lot of work on navigational or, user interfaces types of things, instrument panels and so forth. But further research broadened that perspective so that it became apparent that organizational factors are also underlying human errors in many cases. So these ideas greatly informed my thinking about both the individual factors and the organizational factors for insider threats that are defined in SOFIT.
And that is really for the intentional as well as the unintentional insider threat, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. And what organizational factors stand out to you? Same question as with the individual factors. Are there ones that have a higher correlation with insider risk?
Well, so first of all, just to describe, these the major four classes here that came out of that work. And one way of describing this in a little bit more detail is to kind of point out certain aspects like security policies. Security policies may have deficiencies in hiring practices or in firing practices or in security controls or staff training and awareness programs. And deficiencies in any of these can increase vulnerability to insider threats. Similarly, work environments or work planning and control systems may negatively impact employee morale and satisfaction and produce disgruntlement that can lead to insider threats, malicious ones. And systems that are difficult to understand or use may lead to increased errors. And we know that increased errors will tend to increase the unintentional insider threats. And staff who use shortcuts to try to get around complex security safeguards may also introduce vulnerabilities. Mm-hmm. And perhaps most importantly, management systems may fail to assign sufficiently qualified personnel to tasks or to provide sufficient financial resources. And management practices that produce toxic leaders and toxic work environments may create a breeding ground for insider threats. So all of these factors can serve to increase stress, increase frustration and disgruntlement, which not only impact productivity, but will also impact negatively morale and trust. And these can produce a greater likelihood of insider threats. Now you're asking as well, which factors are strongest? Mm-hmm. That's a difficult to assess because unlike the studies that I did for individual factors, there has not really been a lot of attention paid and certainly not funding for the study of organizational factors specifically within the context of insider threats. There is a fair amount of research, a lot of research actually on counterproductive work behavior in industrial organizational factors research. But in terms of insider threats, I have not conducted the studies similar to the ones that I did with individual factors, where I tried to tap the knowledge of experts and to assess the level of severity of these various factors. So I would say that in closing, in the answer of your question there, that remains to be seen as kind of a research question.
Yeah, and maybe just to prompt you to a topic that you mentioned as well already, which is toxic leadership, increasing insider risk. Can you elaborate a little bit on that as a subject? Because I can imagine that is quite a significant situation.
Well, I can't elaborate too much on it. I've written a couple of things on it. I wrote a little blog about it on my website, and I gave a talk recently, last month, at the SBS Summit on Insider Threats and Organizational Resilience. That was done by the Department of Defense and managed by PERSEREC.
Mhm.
And for that, I spent some time talking about the impacts of toxic leadership and toxic organizations. This, I think, is a major issue, and it needs to be addressed for all kinds of reasons. But in particular, I think it, from an insider threat context, it has that the potential of creating a breeding ground for malicious insider threats.
Yeah, and I think it is good to pay attention to this particular topic, because I think toxic leadership is often seen as the insider threat, but actually it's forgotten that it's providing a breeding ground for insider threats around that toxic leader as well. So it's a double risk, so to say.
Yes, and I would also, as I argued in one of my talks on this, it's not enough to eliminate the toxic leaders.
Mm-hmm.
That's looking at the individuals, but from more of an organizational health perspective, you need to eliminate the conditions or the characteristics of the organization that may be promoting or facilitating the growth of toxic leaders. So
Mm-hmm.
we'll look at more systemic issues.
More systemic issues and even more self-assessment of the organization.
Exactly.
Yeah. Now you've mentioned the organizational factors, the individual factors. Can you say something about judging risk overall? And is it possible to build risk profiles? And within that context, can you expand on the role of the analyst? What are the aspects that analysts should be looking out for?
So yeah, I mean, I've have a number of publications where I've tried to look at threat assessment models to measure risk. And there's, of course, there's plenty of other researchers who are doing the same, and there's commercial products that attest to doing the same. It's a difficult problem. And I would refer you to some of my published research if you want to know more about how I went about that. But in a nutshell, much more work needs to be done there. The research that I did, since I didn't have access to real data and ground truth, which is actually generally a problem for all of the research that's being done here, not just my research. So I addressed that by looking at expert knowledge. What I tried to do was develop threat assessment models that were able to predict the judgments of experts about the severity of threats or combinations of different indicators that made up a case. And that work resulted in perhaps explaining maybe 60% of the variance in expert opinions, which tells us that it's doing fairly well, but there's a lot of room for improvement. And I think that's generally true of automated tools. Automated tools excel at performing continuous analysis, and particularly in integrating multiple asynchronous data sources, which is really what we're talking about. Data sources that reflect both technical and behavioral factors. So these tasks are clearly overwhelming, if not impossible, for humans, since there are literally billions of data points on networks alone, not to mention the behavioral data that can be collected. So these computational tools excel at doing these tasks, which would be very difficult, if not impossible, for humans. But computational tools can't apply the judgment that humans have. So obviously the human analyst must be in the loop. The detection tools perform triage to produce alerts that must be then referred to human analysts who determine if or what form of response is required. So the role of the human, I think, is really more of a supervisory role, and a judgment role after the initial triage is performed. And it is exceedingly important because I don't think we would feel comfortable about going after somebody merely because an automated tool generates an alert. Now, your second question was what to look for. And for that, it really depends on the organization, its mission, and its priorities. There's some discussion about risk appetite. What's the organization's risk appetite? In other words, how much risk are you willing to accept? Where are your most important assets? And what are the expected impacts if an attack occurs on these assets? So what you should be looking for, I think, is centered around those assets. And hopefully you can identify the path towards attacking those access. So sometimes that's called the access path. It's also been called the kill chain. So what's the nature of that access path in order to access the assets and to essentially, conduct that attack? If you can identify observable points or waypoints along that path, then perhaps you can find ways to intervene proactively so you can get left of boom, as I was talking about earlier.
Yeah, there it comes all together. Thanks. We are focused on risk, but did you also look into or find any negative correlations in your research? What I mean is, are you aware of any protective factors that will reduce risk that's also relevant for the analyst?
Yes. And for that, I'm going to go to the critical pathway diagram, at least one version of it that I tend to use. So it's a good question. I think it's useful to consider so-called mitigating factors, things that might help to explain aberrant behavior that is observed. A simple example is contextual information, such as, let's say you have a project deadline looming. Let's say you have a big deliverable due tomorrow. And in order to get that deliverable ready, you're gonna pull an all-nighter. So you'll be working at unusual hours. And maybe, I don't know, in this day and age, I don't know if you do too much printing, but let's say you have to produce a huge report. So you're doing an unusually large amount of printing in the middle of the night. Now, without any other information, this could be suspicious because the analyst may think that you're trying to hide what you're doing. You're performing these things at a time when nobody else is around, and so forth. However, with that additional context, you may judge that, well, this makes sense. So this may not actually be as suspicious as it might seem. So it's important to have non-technical or behavioral data that informs and provides some context to this judgment. To answer your question more directly, in terms of protective factors, I like to think of this critical pathway, and in particular, how might we find ways to exit? Where are there off-ramps from that critical pathway? And this very much requires the type of approach that is more supportive rather than punitive. In other words, if we identify stressors, if somebody is exhibiting behaviors that show that they're under stress, either due to personal problems, there could be financial issues, there could be issues in their personal lives, or professional problems. There might be stress due to issues that they have with coworkers, or issues that they have with perhaps not really fitting very well into their job, or being overworked. There's many different individual stressors that can produce behaviors that are concerning. So any of those things, including precipitating events like, let's say, pending layoffs, or perhaps you're shutting down a facility or relocating a facility, all of these things are observable and measurable. And if you find individuals who are affected by this, then I think that a proper and empathetic approach is to provide counseling or employee assistance or other types of support that might help alleviate these stresses and help them exit the critical pathway. So that's one source of mitigation that's directed towards individuals who are experiencing some level of stress or risk.
Yeah,
Another aspect of this is organizational. It has an organizational focus, because if there are stressors like, say, pending relocation, or if an individual doesn't quite fit in, if their job doesn't really quite fit with what their interests are, or if, as you said earlier, if we find that there's toxic leaders and toxic managers, or other issues in the environment that are impacting morale and productivity, then the organization, through periodic self-assessments, should be able to invoke improvements along the way. And these types of interventions or mitigations can really have long-term major benefits beyond the attention that is given simply to individuals.
yeah. Thank you for that overview. It's a lot of information on this side as well. So the analyst should not only look for risk factors, but should also look at more contextual information. And that could be a mitigating factor. So could be that there is a false positive alert, as they would say so sometimes. And then on the resolution side of things, you have the individual side and the organizational side as well.
Absolutely, yes.
There
hasn't been a lot of quantification of those mitigation factors, but I think that's an area that's ripe for research as well.
Oh, that's good. And I mean, research is relatively young in this space, so I can very much imagine that this is still very much to explore area.
Yes,
indeed. There are already many tools out there to help generate risk alerts. It seems to be a growing subject in the US. Also, if we're looking at vacancies, there are more and more vacancies coming up for insider risk analysts. I personally have the impression that it's more difficult to implement this in Europe. Do you have any views on the challenges there?
Yes. So regarding challenges, there's been increasing interest in going beyond the basic forensic or technical monitoring approaches that are essentially reactive. Those are more or less the forensic tools that are, say, non-controversial and that most organizations are using. Excuse me. So I've argued that behavioral data are needed in order to become more proactive. And the development of so-called user behavior analytics approaches has been increasing. And this represents a step in the right direction, although from what I've seen, I think the user behavior analytics tools is kind of ill-defined, but it seems that it tends to rely a lot on technical indicators still. And so I would still push for the incorporation of more behavioral data to approach the problem from more of the holistic or whole person approach that integrates human resources security and other behavioral data, as well as the more traditional technical data. A major challenge is to adopt this whole person approach that engages all stakeholders in the process. And that's the only way that you're going to really arrive at an effective strategy, if you get buy-in from all stakeholders. And by that, I mean not only management, not only cybersecurity and security, but also, and most importantly, human resources and worker representatives and privacy advocates, and really all staff who are aware of this approach, so that you get buy-in across all levels of the organization. And I think in that way, if you can approach the problem from that perspective, I think that is the greatest challenge, and also it provides also, I think, the greatest rewards.
Thank you. And we discussed also the tension points around that, with the collecting more data, but then at the same time being able to be a bit more proactive. So the next level is that whole person approach, that's for sure. What are your experiences with the levels of maturity of insider threat or risk programs you have seen with organizations? What are their focus areas, and what do you think could be improved?
So yeah, I mean, there's a number of entities that are interested in defining the maturity level. There's an insider threat task force in the U.S. government that's looking at that. Excuse me. And there's also other approaches and ways of defining maturity. One thing that I feel is useful is really to look at three questions: who, what, and when. So in terms of who, the question is, who are you monitoring? Are you tracking activities only of high risk job categories, or are you assessing all employees? Organizations that monitor all roles and all staff are operating at a higher level of maturity. Secondly, what are you monitoring? Programs that focus only on technical indicators are going to be more reactive, as you pointed out. The indicators that are more behavioral tend to occur earlier on. And so if you can do something, if you can mitigate some of those problems and deal with some of these behavioral factors, then you will become more proactive. And that also reflects a higher level of maturity. And thirdly, when are you monitoring? Are you doing continuous monitoring, continuous evaluation, or are you only doing periodic monitoring? Or perhaps none at all after the initial background investigations that are done as part of the vetting or hiring process. Continuous evaluation, continuous monitoring is associated with a higher level of insider threat program maturity. Now, in terms of the status of that, levels, the questions about levels of maturity, there have been several approaches to characterize this, and I like one study that was done, a survey published in 2019, that sort of describes the state of level of maturity across a number of organizations and industries. And so that survey described, they asked for individuals to essentially fill out information that would reflect the types of insider threat programs that they are using. And based on that survey, one can say that roughly 5% of these organizations across all sorts of business sectors could be characterized as having a non-existent insider threat program. In other words, they basically were not doing anything, not doing monitoring, and they probably really didn't even know where to begin with it. So that's a serious red flag there. And a little less than a quarter of those organizations, as they described their insider threat programs, these would be classified as being reactive. And again, that meant that they could be collecting some data, mostly technical data, but they weren't really acting on that data until after the insider exploit occurs. And so they were mostly using the data for forensics to try to figure out what happened, as well as to try to clean up the mess afterwards. So again, that 24% and another 5%, you have almost 1/3 of those organizations who are really quite deficient in their programs. Then maybe a little less than half of those organizations were characterized as proactive. And the definition of proactive in this study was fairly limited in that it applied to organizations that were collecting both technical and some behavioral data, but they were monitoring only high-risk individuals. So it was fairly limited. But for at least for those high-risk individuals, they were acting at a relatively more sophisticated or more proactive level. And then two higher levels, which I would like to combine into what would be called more of a predictive or optimized category. About a little less than 1/4 of those organizations identified that they have a formal program in place to detect potential or active threats more proactively. And they were examining both behavioral and technical indicators, and this was implemented organization-wide. So this would represent the highest level of maturity. So based on these and other results similar to this, we could say that improvement is needed to go beyond the reactive and forensic level and to implement more continuous and more comprehensive monitoring and analysis. And also, I would add, human resources really should become more integrated into the insider threat assessment teams to encourage this more holistic approach.
Thank you very much, Frank. And that whole person holistic approach and the integration of more behavioral data is, I think, key to the discussion that we just had. I wanted to spend a little more time on the unintentional insider threats specifically, because I know you've conducted extensive research with the Carnegie Mellon University about the subject. Could you elaborate a little bit on the research that you've done? And also, could you say there are also individual and organizational risk factors distinguishable specifically for the unintentional insider threats?
Yes. So, yeah, as you said, I spent a couple of years when I was consulting for Carnegie Mellon, so working with their team and doing some of the, I think maybe some of the most early work on defining and studying insider threats and their potential contributing factors. In addition to that, in the last couple of years, I've also done some research with some other partners that was actually under that IARPA program. So I worked with George Mason University and Humro and some others, mostly on malicious insider threats, but also conducting a study on phishing. And I hope to publish that work soon. It's a paper that's currently in review, but I can share a little bit of that information as well. So to answer one of your questions, organizational factors are certainly very distinguishable from individual factors, as I've tried to show in this little depiction here of the soffit ontology and how the two branches are quite distinct. The indicators in the organizational factors branch contribute to insider threats in different ways than the indicators in the individual factors branch. And organizational factors are revealed through different means. They're revealed or measured through periodic organizational self-assessment, such as staff surveys and internal human factors or industrial organizational audits. With regard to some of my recent research, I think maybe I'll leave that to, I think you may have some questions later that I could address with a little bit of detail on that. But there's been a fair amount of research in the past 5 years, published studies on unintentional insider threats and phishing in particular. It's a very challenging area, I would say, very challenging area, because the empirical results are not always consistent across studies.
Yeah, so you're also saying more work needs to be done in this area.
Yes.
Is there any tip of the veil that you could lift with regards to your research? Are there any causal factors? For instance, are there any demographic factors that play a role in the unintentional insider threats? Any more psychological profiles that play any role?
Oops. Yes. Let me actually I don't have a whole lot of technical information to share with you, but I can speak to that a little bit. So we can tentatively associate contributing factors with different types of insider threats, including unintentional insider threats. And as I mentioned, there's been a good deal, well, a fair number of studies that have attempted to identify demographic factors like age and gender, but the results vary widely and are somewhat inconsistent. And I think actually even you have to look closely at the research methods that were employed, because they would cause you to have different interpretations based on different details of the way the research was conducted. I think that the most accurate characterization of the role of demographic factors in unintentional insider threats, and particularly with regard to phishing susceptibility, is that everyone, males and females, young and old, everyone is susceptible to these exploits. Even though some studies might have said that, say, males were more susceptible in some cases, or females, or other studies literally showing, some studies showing that that younger people are more susceptible, and other studies showing that older people are more susceptible. The question is, or the point is, that none of these groups were not susceptible. All of them were susceptible, and there might be small percentages of variation. And that's why I would claim that it's most accurate to say that that each of these, regardless of demographics, everyone is susceptible. Now, you ask about other characteristics. Again, it's very difficult to assess these because, well, not everybody can conduct experiments where you try to measure psychological variables and psychological traits like personality factors. In a study that I did with George Mason University and my colleagues within that IARPA program, we conducted a phishing study at a major university, and there were many thousands of participants. It was between 6,000 and 7,000 participants, in which we tried to assess the susceptibility of these participants to various phishing exercises that we injected into their actual environments. Interestingly enough, though, these types of approaches are plagued by methodological issues, because even though we have potentially 6,000 or 7,000 participants, the number of people who are susceptible, who succumb to the phishing exercise, is roughly on, say, in the order of 20%. So even if you're starting out at 6,000 people, you may be looking at maybe only 1,200 who actually who actually succumbed. So that might be the main group that you're interested in to assess various predispositions or traits. It is compelling to consider that these individuals who succumb to phishing, those who have succumbed to phishing in the past, are more likely to be fooled again. In fact, I think that may be the strongest result that we have obtained, and that has been obtained by others as well. So it's compelling to think that if they're succumbing to phishing, there may be something in their psychological makeup. They may be predisposed in some ways to succumb to phishing. However, it's also possible that there's something in their organizational environment that makes them predisposed to succumb to phishing. For example, if they're working in a stressful environment, they're maybe less likely to pay as much attention to certain cues, and so they may make errors in judgment. So really, I think it's probably a combination of both. And it's difficult to assess this because of the fact that even if we start off with 6,000 individuals, we may only be looking at 1,000. And then if we try to get personality measures, let's say, or other psychological or behavioral measures through surveys, well, maybe only 10% of them respond to the surveys. So while we start off with an initial population of 6,000 or 7,000, now we're dealing with something down in the order of maybe only 100 respondents, and that becomes problematic in terms of having sufficient statistical power to be able to detect differences. Having said that, preliminary analysis in our study suggests at least that people who succumb to phishing may be more impulsive than those who didn't.
Mm-hmm. And I think what also complicates research is to control for organizational factors. So if you want to really isolate individual factors, but they are working in an organization and diverse range of organizations, then you would also have to control for the organizational factors to really understand causality, isn't it? So that these are also difficulties, I can imagine.
Yes, I believe that. So if you have two identical people with the identical experience and background and say psychological or personality factors, if one of them is in a toxic environment and one of them is in a very supportive environment, and they experience the exact same frustrations or disappointments, I would suggest that it's more likely that that individual in the toxic environment will act out, and so you'll be more likely to experience insider threats in those kinds of environments. And I would also like to mention that something that's somewhat frustrating to me, or a hot button for me, is that there's a tendency for some organizations to regard unintentional insider threats in terms of employee negligence. In other words, they want to try to pin the blame solely on the individuals who say they succumb to a phishing exploit. I think that getting into this blame game is not productive, and I think that it deflects attention away from recognizing possible organizational factors that contribute to unintentional insider threats through the increased likelihood of human errors, for example. There's a large body of research in human factors, as I alluded to earlier, and organizational psychology. that argues against blaming users exclusively for outcomes that may also have systemic underlying causes.
And that comes back to the organizational self-assessment and self-awareness.
Yeah.
Maybe that goes nicely into the final question that I had for you. And that's more practically, what mitigation strategies would you recommend to organizations? Specifically maybe for the unintentional insider threats, but maybe also with the intentional in the back of your mind?
Okay, yes. And again, there's sort of a general theme in my answers here, but first of all, certainly training and awareness programs are needed, but I would caution that this will only get you so far, because it has been found that effects of awareness training on unintentional insider threats, as well, I think, as other types of threats, but in particular with regard to unintentional insider threats and phishing, training tends to be short-lived. It may have a slight bump in performance where they become a little bit more aware or alert, but that tends to decay. And so annual security refresher training that occurs maybe only once a year is not going to be very effective. With regard to organizational factors, I think that, as I said before, it's important for companies to recognize their responsibilities. Periodic organizational self-assessment is a critical strategy to establish a more proactive insider threat program. Most organizations are already doing staff surveys to assess morale and other management issues. The difference is that perhaps these data now can be examined by stakeholders who are engaged in insider threat assessment. An insider threat working group can use that data as well to facilitate continuous evaluations that examines behavioral and organizational factors that underlie insider threats. An enlightened organization cares enough about the welfare of its employees to engage human resources in the insider threat risk assessment process, and to provide this whole person approach that I've been talking about, that not only meets organizational security objectives, but also promotes a safe, secure, healthy, and productive work environment. There has been much discussion about organizational resiliency, and I believe that resiliency to insider threats rests on this foundation of technical monitoring, behavioral monitoring, and organizational self-assessment.
I think this is a very nice moment to end the discussion with this whole person approach and the duty of care of the organization also towards the employees. Any final thoughts? Did I miss anything, Frank? Or do you want to leave at least the people with some additional thoughts behind, or are you okay?
Well, I think I pretty much repeated in some ways this theme, but I would welcome other thoughts, and I have a number of publications and some blog postings on my website, which is www.cyberanalytix.com, that I would encourage people to take a look at if they have any questions. And again, I want to thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to answer your very insightful questions.
With very insightful answers. Thank you very much, Frank, for your time. Thank you for your research so far, and we will definitely stay focused on the upcoming research. You mentioned a few things that you're working on. I'm really looking forward to see the results of that. So I'll keep a close eye out on it. So thank you very much again.
Thank you.